Plastic bottles in 1830s American politics. What do they have in common? Well, one of them's something you might need to know, and one of them's something you might want to. My name's Joey O'Donnell, and this is the OShow. BPA. It's a chemical turned scare word that I'm sure you've heard of. But do you know what it actually is? What it does when it's in your body? Whether all that concern is justified? This is BPA, explained by someone who's not trying to sell you something. BPA stands for the chemical bisphenol A. It's everywhere in modern life, usually doing one of two jobs. The first is in polycarbonate plastics, which are found in a wide range of products. And the second is in epoxy resins, which are seen in industrial chemicals, paints, and in the linings of food and beverage containers. BPA is really good at these jobs, so it's become really widespread. People worry about this marvel of human engineering because, as it turns out, it shows up in our bodies. Most human BPA intake comes from food and beverage containers. And once BPA gets in, it tends to stick around. Almost all Americans test positive for BPA in their bodies. In addition, the chemical accumulates in human fat tissue where it can slowly leach into the bloodstream even if no more BPA is coming in. So we know that the stuff is everywhere and that it can get into the human body with ease. Is it harmful? Scientists worry that BPA is an endocrine disrupting chemical, or EDC. Your endocrine system makes the hormones in your body, which have big effects despite being present in minuscule amounts. EDCs, like the hormones they mimic, can be potent at really small concentrations, and they can have contradictory effects at low and high doses, making them very difficult to study. Research on BPA is split into two types. There's correlational studies, which link the presence of the compound to changes in human health, and there's animal trials, where scientists pump a lab rat full of the stuff and see what happens. Neither of these are perfect, but when they all point in a similar direction, the evidence can become pretty strong. These studies implicate BPA in a number of potential human health issues. The most evidence exists for reproductive damage for both men and women. Before BPA was used in plastics, the compound was actually designed as a synthetic estrogen, which is science speak for an artificial compound that acts like a female sex hormone in the body. Naturally, it appears to mess with the female reproductive system. BPA exposure is heightened in individuals with fertility issues and miscarriages, and often rises in women with imbalances to sex hormones. Men, too, show strong correlations between increased bodily BPA and issues with fertility and hormone balance. BPA also affects the body elsewhere. One of the strongest links discovered is between BPA and obesity. Several studies have linked the chemical to weight gain, and animal studies have found a biological explanation for this effect. Other studies have linked BPA to type 2 diabetes. Even the brain could be at risk. The compound has been associated, albeit tentatively, with autism and ADHD onset in children. The literature is far from conclusive. Especially with animal studies, results can vary. A massive 2-year rat study recently found no significant effects of BPA on the health of the rats. But there's enough consensus on the issues I've described and concern about other proposed effects of the compound, such as heightened toxicity to developing fetuses, that the weight of the evidence, to me, lies on the side of caution. BPA is not going to kill you at 50, and it's not going to make you put on 80 pounds. I just want to suggest that, if you can, it's a good idea to avoid it. So let's talk about how to do that. First, are BPA-free plastics any good? A non-toxic replacement for BPA that does all of those jobs won't spring up overnight. Remember, BPA is an engineering miracle. Most replacements for BPA in plastics are very similar to the parent molecule. If you look at the card up here, you'll see BPS and BPF, the two most common substitutes in use today. And if you look really closely, squint those eyes and stare, you might see some glaring similarities. Like their parent molecule, BPS and BPF have become common worldwide, and these two substitutes enter the human body just as easily. Americans exhibit BPS and BPF in the body at levels similar to those of BPA, perhaps because food in American supermarkets are littered with the stuff. And these compounds, like BPA, can pass from mother to infant through breast milk. Due to the newness of these chemicals, there isn't nearly as much available research, but what's out there suggests that these chemicals are just as dangerous as BPA. Animal models find disruption of sex hormones at levels comparable, right in the same ballpark to what BPA did. And similar findings exist for non-sex hormones as well. BPF, and especially BPS, appear to be obesogenic too, meaning they cause weight gain. So switching to BPA-free plastics may not be all that helpful. What else can you do? Unfortunately, some of these chemicals' biological effects are irreversible, especially when the very young are exposed. But you can still undo most of that damage with lifestyle changes today. A good starting point is to minimize your use of plastic, especially in regards to food and drink. It's sensible for anyone conscious of environmental impact anyway. Recycling is kind of a myth. And even plastics without bisphenols can leach toxic compounds of their own into whatever's inside. In general, the rate of chemical leaching from plastics seems to depend on the temperature. Frozen food wrappings are safer, but it's never a good idea to microwave a polycarbonate Tupperware feast. There are a few other things you can do, but avoidance of plastic is definitely the best place to start. Today's world, for all its staggering technology, has a habit of moving too quickly for its own good. Just look at lead, asbestos, DDT, or any of the chemicals that changed the world and then started maiming us. New chemicals of, at best, uncertain safety enter our lives all the time. To me, we have to chart a middle path between indiscriminate avoidance of all things artificial and uncritical acceptance of every new thing. Only as informed consumers can we stay safe. Andrew Jackson was the biggest name in American politics between Jefferson and Lincoln. When he wasn't committing needless genocide of Native Americans, and when he wasn't creating a diplomatic crisis through a careless invasion of then Spanish Florida, he brought American politics to the common person, or at least to the common white man, for the first time. Just as interesting as Jackson himself were the women who left their marks on his life and administration. These women fractured political coalitions, exposed the true colors of hundreds of office holders, and even led a man to his premature death. Let's talk about their stories of love, hate, and everything in between. This was originally supposed to be a Valentine's Day special episode, but that didn't happen, so welcome to the OShow President's Day special. Rachel Donaldson was born to a wealthy Virginia family in 1767. Her father, John Donaldson, was a military colonel and land speculator, and his occupations led the family to the frontiers of Tennessee in 1785. These lands were dangerous, and Native American attacks on their new settlement soon killed Rachel's father and several of her brothers. Her life's rough start grew a little rougher when she, a mere teenager, married a Captain Lewis Robards and moved back to Virginia. Robards proved to be an abusive philanderer, and Rachel fled. Accounts conflict on whether she decided to leave or was kicked out. Though she tried to make the marriage work, she ultimately returned to her mother's home in Nashville with divorce in mind. The Donaldson family, true people of the frontier, allowed boarders to sojourn at their house on their travels. One such frontiersman was a young lawyer named Andrew Jackson, and he and Rachel soon formed an unshakable bond. Both were 21, both loved the lands of Tennessee, and both had lost a lot of family. The two soon became romantically involved, and Jackson helped Rachel seek the process of a legal divorce. Of course, this was the 18th century, and a divorce inquiry from a woman would never fly in court. Rachel realized that she needed Robards to initiate the request. This he did, but he never followed up on the proceedings. Rachel heard that Robards had started to petition the court, and understandably assumed that the matter was settled. 3 years after meeting Jackson, she finally married him in 1791. Robards may have been at fault for the divorce screw-up, but he was furious that his wife, in a legal sense at least, would marry another man. So Robards, following an American tradition hailing from our founding times, took his ex-wife to court on charges of adultery. When Jackson found out, he wrote a letter to the plaintiff, promising to, in person, cut off his ears and possibly another male anatomical structure if the suit were not immediately withdrawn. Robards decided to go one further and finalize the divorce. Finally, in January of 1794, the Jackson couple legally wed. Among the vows shared was Jackson's promise that he would sacrifice 10,000 lives in defense of Rachel's reputation. One could argue that what followed more than fulfilled that promise. The name of Andrew Jackson was quickly becoming well known. The frontiersman had been named Attorney General of Tennessee, and he was considering a run for Congress after his marriage. Unfortunately, Jackson's talents were conspicuous enough to draw the attention of his political opponents, who deemed him too great a threat to trifle with. During the course of Jackson's campaigns, the murmurs that had been present about his and Rachel's marriage grew into full-on attacks. With each political rank Jackson achieved, outcry about his wife became more and more malicious. Jackson, ever irritable and ready to defend his wife, responded with similar hostilities, and the issue of Rachel the bigamist became common talk in high society. The best illustration of this rancor came from the life of a lawyer named Charles Dickinson. His feud with Jackson began when he called Rachel an adulteress. Though he claimed to have been drunk at the time, and though Jackson accepted his apology, bad blood persisted between the two, no doubt spurred on by the obstinate Jackson. A minor spat over a horse racing payout led the two to the dueling fields. What happened there offers perhaps the best depiction of Jackson's luck and character that history can ever provide. Dickinson was known for marksmanship, and Jackson figured that he would lose if he tried a quick shot. So he let Dickinson shoot first, and true to form, Dickinson hit Jackson squarely in the chest. But Jackson simply stood still. He seethed in pain, but he found the strength to line up his own shot. After Dickinson panicked and a firearm defect added to the suspense, Jackson calmly delivered a fatal blow to Dickinson, millimeters away from having sustained one himself. No amount of foolhardy stoicism could save the Jacksons from the unending attacks, though. The frontier lawyer was finding political success after political success, and with his presidential bid in 1824 came a new wave of assaults. Jackson was one of 5 popular candidates, all of whom identified as Democratic Republicans. But Jackson was the lone outsider, with a platform of populism against a dominant business elite, and he unnerved the Washington establishment. Other campaigns made frequent reference to Jackson's first marriage in desperate attempts to sway public opinion. All this national attention wore away at Rachel's health, and it brought Jackson to his characteristic fury, making the vitriol all the greater. At the end of the election, no candidate had enough electoral votes to win outright. The House of Representatives thus got to choose, and it granted John Quincy Adams the office of president in 1824, despite the fact that Jackson had a clear plurality of the electoral and popular votes. The role of Henry Clay, Speaker of the House, in campaigning for Adams outraged Jackson and his supporters, especially since Adams made Clay Secretary of State soon after. This so-called corrupt bargain combined with all the abuse against Rachel to make the subsequent 1828 election downright toxic. Rachel soon suffered one insult too many. Jackson always tried to keep her from realizing just how much she was vilified, but her stress nonetheless built to a fault. She had a stress-induced heart attack and died soon after in late 1828. Had she lived just a few weeks longer, she would have witnessed her husband's inaugural address, having risen from the frontier to become the most powerful man west of the Atlantic. The marriage between the two was hardly perfect. Jackson was in Washington for months at a time on political duty, and the two grew irritable in each other's absence. But Jackson could not imagine a larger loss. He entered the White House with even greater paranoia about his political enemies, but he was at least grateful that he would never again have to defend a woman he cared about from the abuses of politics. Unfortunately, history, kind as it was to Jackson with elections and bullets, had different ideas. Margaret Peggy O'Neill was born in 1799 to a family of innkeepers. The O'Neills ran a prominent Washington hotel and tavern known as the Franklin House. Various men of the town, especially bachelor politicians, would frequent the bar for its less than virtuous attractions. As Peggy grew into adulthood, she quickly became one of the Franklin House's prime charms. Peggy was beautiful by all accounts, but her charisma came from more than just looks. She stood in stark contrast to 19th century expectations of female modesty. Guests loved her strong wit, engaging sense of humor, and bold thoughts on such masculine affairs as politics and economics. When combined with her more flirtatious inclinations, Peg's personality won over hundreds of politicians who walked through the Franklin House doors, earning her the nickname, the politician's pet. Among her admirers was that frontier lawyer and recent widower, Andrew Jackson. Jackson's relationship with Peg seemed to be more fatherly than romantic. He admired her anachronistic moxie, like so many other men at the time, but he treated her more like the daughter he never had. Even after Rachel's death, it appears that this paternal relationship remained strong, though, given Peg's later behavior, one cannot know for sure. Peg was the talk of the town, and rumors flew about her first marriage. She married a Navy purser named John Bowie Timberlake, the two being 22 years apart. Timberlake quickly proved an unsuccessful businessman, though, and debt piled up in the household. Soon after, Peg began having children at times incompatible with her husband's frequent naval trips to the sea. Timberlake died in 1828, 12 years after the marriage. Speculation abounded that he committed suicide to escape his debts and the marital rumors. Peg was unable to escape those pressures, though, and she turned to Jackson for help. He and his friend John Eaton, a Tennessee senator, worked to restore her reputation. They supported her from their own pockets and even tried to add an amendment to a Senate bill that would send public money to the widow. The bill failed, but Jackson showed that he would protect Peg with the same fury that he used with Rachel. Peg moved back to the Franklin House soon after, and locals gossiped about seeing her and Senator Eaton walking around town together. The two shared a tighter bond than just one of money, but no doubt Eaton's financial support swayed Peg's decision. With Jackson's blessing, the pair were married soon after. Many locals were bothered by the haste of this second marriage, only 9 months after Timberlake's passing. It was here that politics once again intervened. Jackson and Eaton were both frontier politicians, known for their opposition to the Washington establishment of the time. Tensions were already ablaze between newly President Jackson and John C. Calhoun, South Carolinian politician and vice president. This alliance, as well as that between Jackson and the rest of the members of his cabinet, was an uneasy attempt to form a functional political coalition. But Jackson never really got along with that elite, and when he named his Tennessee friend John Eaton Secretary of War, a firestorm broke out. No doubt the uproar reflected political differences and emotion left over from that campaign of 1828. But the appointment was only days after John and Peg's unpopular marriage. The establishment members of the cabinet and their wives were outraged at Peg's salacious reputation. Lewis McLean, Jackson's Secretary of the Treasury, jibed that Eaton married his mistress and the mistress of 11 dozen others. Jackson, ever stubborn, tried to defend her with presidential power. With Rachel gone, the White House needed a hostess for formal events, and he made the rash decision to appoint Peg to the role. Cabinet members and their wives refused to visit the White House in violation of many customs of the time. Some accounts argue that Floride Calhoun, the wife of John C., led this opposition, which only deepened the fractures between the frontier president and his establishment allies. The bickering continued to build. Eaton demanded to duel Henry Clay after a sarcastic comment, and Calhoun soon left Washington for South Carolina. Jackson tried to defray the situation by amassing his cabinet at the White House for the night, but his defense of Peg proved awkward and ineffective. The result was governmental paralysis. Neither faction would talk to the other, even about politics, under any circumstances. Something needed to give. The one Jackson-Eaton loyalist in the cabinet, Secretary of State Martin Van Buren, offered a tactical resignation. Jackson used this opportunity to reorganize his entire cabinet, replacing every establishment stalwart with a new loyalist. Calhoun, in response, resigned from the vice presidency, in part due to his suggestion that South Carolina should secede over an 1828 tariff bill, and in part due to this so-called petticoat affair over Peg. He would later try unsuccessfully to run for the presidency. Jackson promoted his loyal friend Van Buren to the vice presidency once he won the election again in 1832. So what became of the Eaton couple? Jackson sent the pair to Spain as ministers of the United States, and though they could not escape the rumors even there, they both loved their time in Europe. Eaton and Jackson actually had a falling out over the presidential aspirations of Van Buren, a spat they wouldn't recover from until Eaton lay on his deathbed. Peggy eventually returned to Washington a widow, but 3 years after Eaton's death, she had a third marriage to an Italian music teacher named Antonio Buccignani. He was 39 years younger, and the marriage proved fragile. 7 years later, Antonio fell for Peg's granddaughter, Emily, and the two ran off to Europe madly in love, taking most of Peg's money with them. Peg never recovered, and she died in poverty in 1879. A bit of poetry should be accorded to the fate of Margaret O'Neill Timberlake Eaton Buccignani. She was buried alongside Eaton, lying near both passionate lovers and spiteful detractors from around the city. Her petticoat affair brought these people to hatred and paralyzed an entire government, all over something so unnecessary. But no matter how entrenched those divides seemed, no matter how strong the hatred between the two sides became, their common humanity caught up to them all in the exact same way. Maybe the actors of today's great squabbles will one day rest together so serenely.